Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and here with Bruce Fein. And today we're going to do something different. We are now beginning. Bruce has frequently recommended the fact that he has a recommended list of books that he believes his suggestions with respect to what an informed citizen, the knowledge base they should have to be an informed citizen and be able to contribute more productively into the political debate. I think it should be non-controversial that when we discuss policies, politics, and even what we can learn from our past, that we actually have an accurate portrayal of what our past really is and the lessons to be learned from it. Um, Bruce has frequently stated that the beginning of the American Empire began with the Spanish-American War, and so since this is a topic that is uh, dear to Bruce's hearts, that I think should be dear to everyone's hearts, who want to conserve a republic, and I think it's impossible to actually, and I know Bruce feels the same way, that you have to make a choice. Do you want to be a constitutional republic or an empire? You can't be both.
Right.
So when America decided to be an empire, it basically surrendered its attributes as a constitutional republic. I would argue that maybe that was the day the empire began, but the seeds of the empire, I think, were already established much earlier. I think first with the resettling of the indigenous population in the country, then the ideas behind Manifest Destiny, and also the Mexican American War, I think were the beginning of our debate about whether we were going to preserve the principles of a constitutional republic, or were we concerned about expansion and the philosophy of an empire. And it was the closing of that period where we formally established ourselves as an empire, um, was with the Spanish American War. So first, let me say the title of the book we're going to be discussing today. That was Bruce's first selection. It's called Splendid Liberators: Heroism, Betrayal, Resistance, and the Birth of American Empire, written by Joe Jacks. I'm also, before turning this over to Bruce, I'd like to also I'd also like to mention the opinion of somebody who has who should have even more authority than any of us here discussing the book, because this is a person who actually enlisted in the Marines at 16 years old. He lied about his age just to be able to fight in the Spanish American War. Okay, that person is Major General Smedley Butler, who at the time of his death was the most decorated Marine in American history. He received two Medals of Honor, the Marine Corps Brevet Medal, and a number of other decorations for his actions in the Philippines, in China, in Central America, and the Caribbean. So, and he described these actions later. He became maybe the most famous military critic of American imperialism. He's someone who had spent 33 years of his life as an American imperialist and then had great regret for it. And what he called it was a high class muscle man for big business and a racketeer for capitalism. And to give further perspective on what he was involved in as a Marine, he was involved in the Philippines. He fought there as a young officer. Then he was part of the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. In 1903, he was in Honduras protecting American interests. In 1909 to 1912, he was in Nicaragua on multiple interventions. In 1914, he was in Veracruz occupation, which was his first Medal of Honor. In Haiti, he was there from 1915 to 1918. He led the invasion and occupation, where he got a second Medal of Honor. Then in 1916, he was in the Dominican Republic, also involved in the occupation. And then he was in France, where he fought in World War I. and then where he was back in China from 1927 to 1929, where he commanded the Marines in Shanghai. And his conclusion from this is war is a racket. It's always been. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in life. And then he further went on to say there are only two things that we should fight for. One is defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. For any other reason is simply a racket. So with that introduction, Bruce, I turn the conversation over to you, and you can talk about why you chose this as the first book, and what are the things that you think people should learn from reading the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. First, I want to invite all the listeners, our participants here. You can get my 100-book reading list at my website, www.lawofficesofbrucefein.com. Secondly, I think there may have been even someone superior to the Marine that you mentioned with regard to war. His name was Ulysses Grant. And in his memoirs, this was the general of the Union Army. He didn't have scruples about killing. He participated in the Mexican-American War. This is, you pointed out, that's kind of the seeds of the Spanish-American War. And he said it was the worst war he had ever encountered. It was terrible. It was just like these European countries, like the British Empire and the French Empire, running around and destroying weak people for no reason other than that they had the power to do so. That was Ulysses Grant, the one who was sitting at Appomattox Courthouse with Robert E. Lee after the Wilderness Campaign and other things. Anyway, I want to start out for why did I select this book, Splendid Liberators, the Spanish-American War, because although in some sense saying something is an inflection point is a little bit artificial because there's continuity between all days of some sort or another. But the reason why I selected the Spanish-American War is because I think it was the first time when we openly and notoriously sought empire without embarrassment. We weren't trying to use euphemisms. The Spanish-American War was not fought because we had any threat from Cuba. There were no Soviet missiles in Cuba. The Spain then had Cuba as a colony. It was weak as could be. And the Spanish-American War, in some sense, was sparked by then Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, who thought that your manhood was established by killing other people in wartime, that if you didn't have wars, your civilization would weaken. That is the glory is killing other human beings. And the greater glory was to make sure that the victims were Asians, non-white Anglo-Saxon Americans, because they didn't really count for very much. And the Spanish-American War also is unique because even the earlier times that you mentioned, the Mexican-American War or even Manifest Destiny, which really was born of the Trail of Tears and the deportations, if you will, of Native American Indians out to pass the Mississippi. They were times when the United States did not yet have the industrial capability of being a global empire. It's true that those incidents set the stage for a continental empire, if you will. The Mexican-American War, assuming and asserting rights over the West Coast, preparing to fight Britain over expansion of the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But we didn't have the ability at that time to project ourselves globally. It was continentally. The Spanish-American War took us to a new level, global overreach. It was no longer on the North American continent. Remember, we were fighting purportedly to help emancipate Cubans from Spanish yoke in Cuba. Why do we end up in the Philippines? Why do we end up in Guam? Why do we end up in Puerto Rico? It's because at that time, I think our culture and the political leadership, the intellectual leadership decided, let's be an empire. We are jealous of Britain. We're jealous of France. We can replace them because our industrial capacity at that time had soared past that of Britain and France. And we said to ourselves, I mean, because the culture couldn't resist what I call the Faustian temptation to try to rule the world, but give up our devotion to liberty and republicanism, which I think is exactly what happened with the Spanish American War. Uh, we denied, think of this hypocrisy, if you will, Jeffrey, and all the audience here. Um, Remember our Declaration of Independence. It says that everyone is entitled to government by the consent of the governed, although we enforce it only in the sovereign areas that we control. And so after we defeated or ousted Spain from the Philippines, the Filipinos said, well, we'd like self-determination, citing our own Declaration of Independence. We want to run our own country. And the United States responded, no, our declaration is only for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You're Asians, you're the white man's burden, in the words of Rudyard Kipling. We need to take care of you, and you don't get to have self-determination. Moreover, you're really subhuman. We're killing anybody who is over 10 years old as a potential terrorist, the same way that we're now killing anybody who we suspect may be a drug trafficker without any declaration of war, without any due process. We began torture with waterboarding, and tens of thousands of Filipinos died. It was a very brutal war from 1902 to 19. And think of this, it comes right on the heels of our emancipation of the Cubans from Spanish colonialism. And then as soon as we emancipate the Cubans, but we didn't do completely, because we occupied Cuba and made certain that the first constitution gave us permanent use at very nominal cost of Guantanamo Bay, which we still occupy today. We forced it down their throats since we dominated the Cuban Revolution, if you will, with our armed forces. But at the same time, we were purporting to rescue Cubans from Spanish colonialism. We were imposing the same colonialism on the Philippines, without any embarrassment. And
Bruce, I'd like to just interject. I think this is very appropriate, your discussion of this topic today. One, for the reasons that you already articulated, but the second reason is there seems to be a rearticulation now in Trump of basically going back to do exactly the same thing now and it's it's perversion of the Monroe Doctrine. This is not a corollary,
No.
to the Monroe Doctrine. That's an absurd. It is not a corollary. It's a complete perversion, of the Monroe Doctrine. And basically, he's giving the argument it's America's burden. He doesn't look at it as a burden. He probably has a fun time doing it. But look at it, and also for people to be clear about the type of speeches that we're giving. At that time, I have a quote from Senator Albert Beveridge.
Yeah.
God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has made us adepts in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. If we look at the language Trump uses and how he describes people, Somalis and people from so many other parts of the world, what does he say? They're drug dealers, cartel. Everything is very negative. They suck. Their people suck. Their culture sucks. Their politicians suck. Everything sucks. And so really the language of, maybe you could say it's not white supremacy today, but, I would argue, I believe Trump is a white supremacist.
Yeah.
So that's just a personal opinion. But either way, this is an American supremacy doctrine, that Trump is advocating today, and it's a reminder how repulsive, we now look and judge, the creation of empire is, we're reasserting, a very ugly part of American history, and also how the courts enable this. And because you've already touched on the topic right now, so maybe we should get into you describing the insular cases that created this perverse doctrine that probably was antithetical to, Ben Franklin said, wherever, he resides, wherever liberty is, I don't think the founders ever thought of contemplating that we were going to conquer foreign lands, and not give this and believe that we have inalienable rights If they're inalienable rights and they come from God, basically, is the statement now saying is those inalienable rights that come from God, God only endowed on people who live in this geographical boundary and nowhere else? If we went to liberate people, if we were supposedly splendid liberators, okay, did we really liberate, or did we change the control of who became, their? We didn't give people, we didn't give those people inalienable rights. And in the insular cases, the Supreme Court, confirmed that there was no obligation, that if we conquered anybody by force, that and we occupied them, that they were not necessarily entitled to these inalienable rights, because apparently these inalienable rights given were God given. God only gave to that geographical region in the world. So, which I think is absurd, but I guess a nationalist would find comfort in those ideas, in a sense of having an attitude of supremacy. So, do you want to get into the
Yeah,
insular?
I will get into those. Let me as a preface to that, the insular
Sure.
cases. Um, I'd like to say I do think we're clearly. I don't know. It's Trump. I think the Trump administration is white supremacist. You notice that he's assailed the European countries, saying they're destroying civilization. Why? Because they're letting people into the country who are not white. That's clearly what he's saying. That you cannot be a virtuous person unless you have white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background descent to you. Now, the other things that interesting is that it's true that in Trump's second inaugural, he did mention William McKinley and Manifest Destiny, which is exactly where we're going back to. That is part of his, I think, mental universe, if you will. And thirdly, I would say it is the language of Beveridge and others at that time of the United States or Americans being God's new chosen people. In you could say in succession to the Jews, who were the first chosen people, and then the Pope or the Christians were the second chosen people, if you will. And it's relevant to point out that God's first chosen people, the Jews, they conquered Canaan by force and violence. Joshua entered the promised land. It was occupied by 7 or 8 other countries, or sovereigns, if you will. He destroyed all of them. And it wasn't by popular vote. When the Christians then became part of the Roman Empire with Constantine's conversion, they started on the Crusades. And so Jesus had turned the other cheek, and peace turns into just wars, meaning you can kill anybody who's not a Christian, especially if they're Jews and Muslims. So that's the history of the species, if you will. Everyone thinking they're chosen people, they're the master race. And we resist because I believe that there's an element of narcissism here. We think that Adolf Hitler's idea of the master race was born out of nothing. At the time of the Spanish-American War and our engagement in the Philippines, that was the birth of the eugenic movement that Hitler ultimately adopted when he killed people who he didn't think had the right Anglo-Saxon genes in them. But we were also doing this, not quite as brutally, but through sterilization of anyone we thought who would bring forth, people who didn't have the right color, skin color, religion, or complex. So those are, I believe that all of these, show that we are basically embracing the ethos, if you will, of the Spanish-American War. Now, the insular cases are interesting, for at least partly because they can be compared, Jeffrey, to the way in which we conceived of rights at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. That it was obtained we bought the Louisiana Territory, and there was a huge debate over whether or not could we really buy it and deny them rights of that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights. Could we just keep them there and not have states and just rule over them, with despotisms? And it was insisted upon that when we obtained the cession of the Louisiana Purchase, that the regions would be incorporated as states on an equal footing with other states, as soon as possible. It was never conceived that we could control that territory, indefinitely without giving self-government. That was very, very central to the willingness to actually accept the Louisiana Purchase. Now, with regard to the insular cases, the Supreme Court said, well, if we conquer, they don't necessarily become part of the United States, entitled to the rights of U.S. citizens, and we can keep them as basically conquered people indefinitely until we decide to admit them. And if we think today, we still have Puerto Rico, it's not a state. We still have Guam, which is not a state. We still have the Marshall Islands and Micronesia, not a state. Um, and the Philippines, we ultimately, after World War II, we granted them their independence, although we kept military bases there like we did in Cuba, up until very recently. But it was a complete denial, certainly the Spanish American War, of our own
I have a question on this point
precepts.
first. Um, I think it is a sad statement of American history that we continue to occupy people, that we don't give inalienable rights, we don't give inalienable rights. We're probably likely to have something that is a case that's 90 years old that will likely be overturned, a precedent that really was established before the Humphrey case, that was unanimously ruled on. That pretty much has been the precedent since 1787 and the founding of the country. This is the beginning of the constitutional period. So we don't mind overturning, and several people, like Thomas has said, precedents are pretty irrelevant now. Under certain conditions. Is the fact is, who actually would have standing to bring a case to the Supreme Court to basically challenge the results of the insular cases? And I would like to remind people of Justice John Marshall Harlan's dissent in the case, where he had warned that the idea that this country may acquire territories anywhere upon the earth by conquest or treaty and hold them as mere colonies or provinces, the people inhabiting them to enjoy only such rights as Congress chooses to accord them, is wholly inconsistent with the spirit and genius, as well as with the words of the Constitution. So, I mean, I like the fact that it's not only inconsistent with the spirit, but the genius and the words, of the Constitution. So,
It was directly opposite to what happened with the Louisiana Purchase, where they insisted and all the territory came
but
in.
who could bring the case now? Who would have standing to challenge the insular case?
Well, probably people. I mean, one of the elements, Jeffrey, if this colonial status is not permitted, that would mean that we could not limit imports. They would be part of the U.S. economy. The Commerce Clause would require that we accept their commerce on the same way we do various states in permitting a free flow of interstate commerce. So someone who is trying to sell from one of these jurisdictions and would like to challenge the ability of the United States to impose a tax or tariffs or limit it probably would have an economic interest that would give them standing. Now, it is true that in the last year, Justice Gorsuch, in one of his dissents from denial of certiorari, suggested the U.S. Supreme Court should re-examine the insular cases, but it hasn't done so. He was just one vote. But I think Justice Harlan was exactly right. The idea that we would then become colonists ourselves, and after we revolted and said this is against human nature and against any international standing which celebrates liberty, is terrible. And it reminds me of Abraham Lincoln. He says, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. As we would not be colonized, we do not want to be colonizers either. That is the precept, that's the spirit and the letter of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. And we clearly are not honoring that insofar as we continue to have these dependencies. You remember, even after World War II, we were using our sovereign assertion over the Marshall Islands and in the atolls in the South Pacific. and to explode nuclear devices, and we contaminated and basically destroyed the populations of all these islands because of the radioactivity. They didn't have any say in this whatsoever, uh, and that's really quite dastardly for a country as powerful as ours. And I want to go back again to show the difference, if you, even though it's a little bit
Yeah.
general.
Before you go back, I just want to make one other interjection before you go back,
Sure.
because I think it's really important. And because I did some research after you had mentioned about, this is also the period of, the American eugenics movement.
Yeah.
And when people think about like that the American eugenics movement, as I did research on after upon your suggestion, that which I thank you for, is really the precursor of that. There's not a lot new under Hitler's Nazism.
Yeah.
You have, I found the names of several individuals: Charles Davenport, who created the eugenics record office at Cold Spring Harbor, which became the command center for American eugenics; Harry Laughlin, who actually drafted the model eugenical sterilization law that served as the template for state laws across the country and was later adopted with acknowledgement by Nazi Germany. Then there's also Madison Grant, a lawyer, a conservationist, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, which argued that the Nordic race was being swamped by inferior Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Hitler called that book his Bible, okay? My Bible were his words. And then there was Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which warned of the demographic threat posed by non-white populations globally. And who else also were teaching course in eugenics? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford all offered courses in eugenics. There were scientific societies, including the American Society for the Advancement of Science, the American Medical Association, the Carnegie Institution, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman family all provided substantial funding towards eugenic research. And the government had a federal immigration policy, state sterilization laws, and there were marriage restrictions that were shaped by eugenic thinking. So so it's not as if Hitler had a lot of original ideas. It's the fact is that we tried and tested these ideas first, and so it's not like Hitler operated in a vacuum, and that we should say a lot of what he did, towards Jews is something that we ourselves did, not towards Jews, but towards other groups. So it's just that Hitler chose, to some extent, different groups. I mean, there were some groups Hitler and us probably agreed with, and some we didn't necessarily agree with as strongly as Hitler did. But I think people are not really we talk about what people should learn to be an educated person, and we should when we look ourselves in the mirror, we should be seeking the truth, not an idealized, fantasized version, not a Hollywood version, or made in Magaland version, or anywhere else. We need to have the integrity to really look truthfully, at our past, and maybe we'll understand be wiser about our present if we understand our past. Okay, that doesn't mean we necessarily have to. We have to necessarily, feel guilty ourselves for what were our past. But what we need to know is enough about our past so we don't commit the same sins, our forefathers committed. So we have to understand when people take a look at us, that there's a past of their interaction with us and why that shapes their attitude towards us. We have to have some understanding of that. So so I think this is really very, very important that how we interact with other nations, with other cultures, with other countries, with other people. It has some path dependency to it because people have had interactions and experiences with us, and on the most part, they've really not been positive. And we've tried to shape it as everything we've done has been for the cause of freedom, and that we're great liberators, and that we've created this democracy everywhere, and what we really respect are inalienable rights everywhere around the world, and that we're these non-interventionist people who don't believe, who only believe in liberty and inalienable rights, and justice, and that's just garbage. So we have to face that fact that we refuse to do.
Yeah,
So
I would just point out, Jeffrey, a couple things here. One, what you've said is absolutely accurate. It was Georges Santayana, a philosopher at Harvard, said if you fail to remember the past, you'll be condemned to repeat it. And it wasn't at the time we didn't put Jews in gas chambers, but right at the time of the Spanish-American War and afterwards with the eugenics movement, we placed ceilings on the percentage of Jews that could enter these Ivy League institutions. They're quotas. They began as a quota. Now the Jews, we don't want them in there. They're dirty, so we have to limit, even though that they excelled scholastically for a variety of reasons. And the other thing that I think that's important to point out is that the Spanish-American War, it was more global than others, but it's not an accident that just at the time of the Spanish-American War, we annex Hawaii with a military-sponsored coup. We go into Panama to have it secede from Colombia to build the Panama Canal. You point out, we're into Nicaragua, we're into the Dominican Republic, we're into Haiti. We're chasing after Pancho Villa in Mexico for a whole year with John Pershing. We're into Honduras to protect United Fruit Company. So this was not just a one-off. It came with our ability at the outset to dominate with force and violence all of Latin America. And then later on, obviously, we projected globally. Now, I think that it's important to compare that attitude where our greatness was viewed as domination for the sake of domination. If we can conquer you, we must be superior to you morally, which is not at all necessarily true. Simply because someone has big muscles doesn't mean they have any moral superiority. And I think it's useful to compare what I call the benchmark of our republic in terms of ethos and values. And I think it was perhaps best expressed by then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. This was a July 4th, 1821 address to the Congress. And he said that in the United States, we're different from Europe because our glory is liberty, the march of the mind, not power and domination, the march of the foot soldier. And he was celebrating the United States as 1821 as superior to Europe, including the Napoleon Bonapartes and his like. Even though they could conquer places, they didn't have any, they did not cherish the kind of wisdom and individual opportunities that we did in the United States. They didn't cherish liberty. And that's certainly true with Great Britain as well. But by the time of the Spanish-American War in the 1900s, we had cast that aside as an ethos. No, hey, we can be better than these people if we can conquer them. And no longer were we celebrating liberty. It was like you were pointing out, Senator Albert Beveridge, who at one time was a presidential candidate, saying, no, God made us as a chosen people to celebrate liberty. No, to dominate the world, to tell other people how to live their lives, because we're flawless. No one is say is so saintly they get to tell other people how they ought to live their lives. But what comes, I think, as necessarily accompaniment with empire mentality, Jeffrey, it's the breakdown of separation of powers. If you're going to have an empire, you got to have limitless executive power because you can't conquer people and run wars unless you have unity of command. You got to have secrecy and speed. Deliberation doesn't count. And that's why de jure or de facto, every empire is run by just one person. Even if you think, for example, the British Empire, whoever thinks in World War II that there was anybody but Winston Churchill who ran Great Britain? I mean, we assume that Winston Churchill was, even though under the parliamentary system, presumably parliamentary supremacy is there. But the parliament turned into just an ornament, right? Under the British Empire. And that was true with prior prime ministers, William Pitt the Elder, William Pitt the Younger, because these are institutional requirements of empire. Speed, secrecy, strength, energy, dispatch. And so when we decided that we wanted to be an empire rather than a republic, the separation of powers breaks down. And over time, all infinite power gravitates from the legislative or judicial branches, but mostly the legislative branch, to the executive branch. And that's why is that? It's what Cicero said: in times of war, the law is silent. Anything can be done under a national security banner, which is in fact is what has happened. Um, and so during World War I, the Congress surrendered virtually all control over the economy to the president, who not only had the Federal Reserve, but we had nationalizations of railroads, and you had Bernard Baruch as he's running the War Mobilization Board, and the government then becomes heavily involved in the economy. You make all these decisions. We have debt that goes from $1 billion to $30 billion, and oversight diminishes. The very few, if any, hearings. You have the invocation of state secrets. You have the suppression of dissent, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, enabling Wilson to imprison thousands, maybe more than thousands, for simply dissenting from our believed stupidity and entering the war. And not only that, his extension of the war to try to block the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which he had no authority to do. So he silenced his dissenters. It's not an accident that he called immigrants, those who were even naturalized, pouring poison into our arteries. He clearly was someone who felt very suspicious about any immigrant, about anybody who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon American. And so World War I then begins this breakdown, if you will, in separation of powers. Some of it comes about, Jeffrey, because the president then is given a license to lie. For example, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a big casus belli that got us into the World War I, was sinking a ship, Americans were on it, that was carrying ammunition for the Allied powers. It was a legitimate target for German submarines. And Woodrow Wilson denied that there was any ammunition, that there was any contraband on this ship. And he said that the German submarine attack was lawlessness. It wasn't. That's why the Lusitania sank very quickly, because the explosion of the of all the artillery shells that were in the boat, on the boat. And so, as we remain an empire, the power of the delegation goes from the Congress to the executive branch. Now, there was one hiccup in that steady accretion of executive power. It was called Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a senator who hated Woodrow Wilson. He's from Massachusetts. He was a royalist, really, and when Teddy Roosevelt was around and William McKinley, he was in favor of the Spanish-American War, but he hated Woodrow Wilson terribly. And Woodrow Wilson wanted to have the authority of the president to undertake any war anywhere in the world to protect an existing boundary, no matter how artificial or unjust it was. And that was his League of Nations idea that he negotiated over in Paris after World War I. And Henry Cabot Lodge, when it came time to consider ratification of the treaty, said, no, we're not going to do that. We are not giving the president the power to go to war anytime he wishes, when he says we have to protect an international boundary. And so the League of Nations then, it shipwrecked on the mulishness of Wilson and refusing to concede, congressional war power. And so the reservations that Lodge required in order to ratify the treaty didn't pass, including the reservation saying that the president can't go to war without Congress's authorization. But that was basically, I think, the last serious, congressional resistance to war. And since that time, with President Roosevelt, the secrecy increases. We have the executive branch making up this idea of classified documents, the state secrets privileged, the oversight becomes much more marginal. And even with regard to the Manhattan Project, theirs shared with a few committee chairmen, but that all was done in secrecy, staggering amounts of money being spent. I'm really generalizing a whole lot since then. But ever since World War I, our mission has been to control and dominate the world, projecting one president after another, never retreating power. And even if you come to a president who's viewed as someone who's the arch conservative, Calvin Coolidge, he was fighting wars against Cesar Sandino in Nicaragua. We're still dealing with that, 50, 60 years later with the Sandinistas, in Nicaragua. He wasn't getting the United States and shutting down all of these, the bases and our presence in Dominican Republic and Haiti and elsewhere. And he certainly did not attack what I consider the intellectual philosophical foundation of the empire, beginning with the Spanish American War, which is, hey, we're a chosen people. Other people have to bow down to our greatness because we are all born with angelic genes and we're saints. And if you don't have a white skin color, you're really not an American. um, the opposite of what we began as a country, where we welcomed immigrants from all over the world. In some sense, we're all immigrants because Native Americans were here before all of us. But even in the highest echelons, Henry Gallatin of Switzerland, serving as Secretary of Treasury under Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton was an immigrant, as well as an illegitimate child coming from a British colony. Those are the kinds of people we celebrated if they had the merit, which they did, and we turned on ourselves and decided, if we have to choose between a republic and liberty and an empire and world domination, hey, let's go for the domination and get the adrenaline high that we have out of dominating other people, even though it's pointless and we don't even know why we're there. And unfortunately, we still live with that mentality.
We think we're splendid liberators.
Yeah, we
So
think
we think we're morally superior, and we're splendid liberators. As you're talking, I was thinking that really, a person that I know we both have high respect for. You place him a little higher up than I do, but I still have tremendous respect for him. Is James Madison?
Yeah.
And James Madison said, "No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." If you're an empire, I think by definition, to be an empire, and we have to think about what the facts are today. We're going to spend about $1 trillion, not on a Department of Defense, because the Department of Defense doesn't need $1 trillion. We're spending $1 trillion on a Department of War. Okay, so it's the largest part of our budget. I think, I don't know if it compares to the interest expense, but either that or the interest expense is where we spend most of the money, right now in our budget. So, but the interest expense we have is a product of all the decisions that have been made in the past, and our Department of War is a decision we're making today on how much we're spending today, and it is a war department. It's not to defend our national interests. It's to create a warrior class as the national strategy, to dominate a region of the world and wherever else they think it needs to be, and that's why we have bases and troops, all over the place, and why we're killing people, currently in various locations. So we are in a state of continual warfare. Basically, in my whole adult life, we've probably been at war almost the entire time. Maybe if we had learned the lessons, and when we all went to school, we learned the truth about the Spanish-American War, that we're not splendid liberators. Maybe the American people, when they were confronted with, should we be in Korea? Should we be in Vietnam? Should we be in Iraq? Should we be in Afghanistan? Should we have bombed Iran? Maybe if Americans had a better education and were exposed to the truth about our past aggressive interventions in the world, and how it's made us the worst versions of ourselves, maybe we would not continue to make these mistakes. And that's why I think getting people exposed to your ideas and talking about this book is so important. I would also like to quote Madison again. Madison said, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people." So he said the same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. So those were the words that preceded the final sentence, being, "No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." I don't think anybody could say that any better, Bruce.
No,
What
no,
do you think?
you can't. And not only that, Jeffrey, James Madison was unique in another respect too. In 1810, when he's president, um, the Senate passed a bill that would have given him limitless discretion to go to war to protect maritime commerce against predation by Britain and France. He said, "You can't do that. War is only something that you can decide. You can't give that power to the president." And he urged his son-in-law in the House to kill the bill, and it was. This is 18, and the only president who ever turned and said, "You cannot give me that war power." Also, when the War of 1812, declared by Congress, was declared, in large measure because the British were kidnapping our citizens and impressing them in the British Navy, because the British Navy, if you've read Billy Budd and know what it was like living in a dungeon. He made very clear that notwithstanding war, he is the only wartime president that did not suspend any civil liberties. Free speech flourished. There's no Sedition Act. There's no Alien Act. He insisted that this war is going to be fought, but it's not going to, and it was declared by Congress, but it didn't encroach on any civil liberties. And I believe it was Madison who understood and said that the entrustment in the Constitution of the war power to the Congress and not the executive was the crown jewel of the entire document. That all history showed that to the extent that the war power lies in the executive, to that extent you don't have any liberty. Because what really is war? Strip it of euphemisms. It's legalizing what in peacetime is first degree murder. You get to kill people who are not threatening your life. If you did it in peacetime, you wouldn't have a self-defense. You'd be charged with first degree murder. So it's a terrible thing. And I'm not a pacifist. I believe in self-defense. We have a right to retain and defend our country from attack. But that's the limit, I believe, in the use of violence, in self-defense, to make sure that our own right to survive is not extinguished. And it's not because I believe it means the rest of the world will all live in some kind of nirvana, some palatial, gentle situation. It's knowing the limits on what we can do, that we cannot turn Afghans into Canadians. We need to know that in our effort, even if it has some kind of benign motive, although I've never known government motives to be benign, they're mostly all malignant. They're not philanthropists, they're about power. Still, there is limits to what we can do to try to change other cultures and societies. Think, as one example, among limitless, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, spent over $2 trillion. It didn't change anything other than we have now a worse version of the Taliban than we started with. It accomplished nothing. You cannot change cultures other than by example and letting them evolve in their own ways. That doesn't mean we let them attack us. I say we should have a policy of invincible self-defense. It should be, you attack us, we're going to destroy you, but otherwise leave us alone. We'll have commerce, we'll engage in conversations. We won't necessarily applaud what you're doing, but we're not going to resort to war, force, and violence. We have our own speech, and our own standards speak volumes about who we are, just how we conduct ourselves, and that will be an example for other people to accede to or not in their own countries. But we don't use force. We don't create revolutions at the end of bayonets, but with ideas, and that was what was so unique about our American Revolution.
Yeah, I think also regarding I think a lot of the people, I think most of those that defend, a very expansive view of the presidency, their citations are generally Hamilton,
Yeah.
about the expansive view of the executive branch. But I think there's a reason why Madison is called the father of the Constitution and not Hamilton is the father of the Constitution. I think it's probably people should read about the ratification process, because it was not easy to ratify. Many of the people had demanded, the Anti-Federalists had demanded that there be the Bill of Rights, which then, James Madison, in wanting to get the Constitution passed, became an advocate of the passage of a Bill of Rights, which he helped prepare. He was the main author of most of the Bill of Rights. Some of the bills the 10 that we had were approved. There were others that were suggested that were voted down. but the 10 that we have, were approved. So we could say out of the constitutional debate, Madison won, not
Yeah,
Hamilton. Hamilton was the loser. Okay,
yeah,
so you can't cite the loser as if they were the winner, because they weren't. Unfortunately, the world has now cited Hamilton, but I tend to I like to ask people. Of course, it's just speculation. Given how difficult it was, the Articles of Confederation, most people agreed was a mess. Okay, so there was a small group of people that became a larger group of people that said, well, we have to have some sort of, and initially, even at the Constitutional Convention, there were also debates about not even having an executive branch and not having a presidency. So these were seriously discussed, and you had people like specifically Hamilton and maybe like a James Wilson who liked a stronger executive. But I ask people, do you really think that the people would have ratified if they went around listening to Alexander Hamilton, and that was the final document produced, where basically they wanted to have someone who would serve for life with basically power that would be comparable or maybe even greater than the monarchy? Would the people have said, "Yeah, I want to turn over. I don't want the Articles of Confederation anymore. I want this." There's a reason for why Hamilton lost. Hamilton lost because his point of view was in the minority, and also the recognition that they wanted to get a document passed, and that his vision would never have been ratified.
yeah. If I could just add this, Jeffrey, is that first of all, Hamilton left the convention in midstream because he proposed that the president serve for life, and it was so thoroughly rejected it didn't even come to a vote. Now, the second thing, even in my view, the executive that was created, which was modest under the Constitution, and remember, Article 2 is very brief, the enumerated powers belong all to Congress. But the reason why the public and the framers accepted an executive as powerful as it was, two words: George
George Washington.
Washington. They trusted him. He's the presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention. Could you imagine if they had Caligula or Nero or Claudius sitting at the convention? There wouldn't have been an Article 2 at all.
I think everyone at the convention knew that they were writing this document for him, that he was going to be
Yeah.
the president. So I think there was no doubt who the indispensable American was.
Yeah.
That's why he's considered by many the father of the country.
Mhm.
The indispensable American, maybe the only indispensable person, was George Washington. So, but they understood that while they were writing a document where they knew he would be the person, they knew not everyone else would succeed him would
Yeah.
be a George Washington. So they would not unwise, stupid people, naive people. So they knew that the first person who would be administering this document as its president would be George Washington, and maybe some of them knew that some of the people in the room were also going to be people that succeeded him, but they were not so they were perceptive enough to understand as you got further down the road, that they were not going to be George Washingtons who would win an office that really required people to maintain a virtuosity about them, and in order to prevent tyranny. So the document was designed, to facilitate George Washington, but also to prevent tyrants and despots, becoming presidents and putting a check on them. But basically, my point is that people who cite Hamilton
Yeah.
are intellectually dishonest because his view lost. Okay. He was not the prevailing opinion. He was not the minority opinion. And to represent his view as having any sort of validity in the final document, we have a very simple example. We have the main author, and we have the behavior of the main author when he was president. So
Okay.
what other, if I'm on the Supreme Court and I kind of want to look at what were these words and what was the intention of these words, why would not the first thing I'd look at is why would I not look through everything James Madison said? And why would I not look at how James Madison governed? Because I think he would probably have some decent understanding of what he meant by the words that he was the principal author of. And what source would have greater authority than that?
Yeah, if you're going for original meaning and popular understanding, and remember, before his 2 terms in the presidency, Madison served in the House of Representatives, as you pointed out. He basically orchestrated the Bill of Rights, and then he served 8 years as Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson. So he's there, he's present at the creation, and his words should be virtually authoritative. Now, the other thing I believe is important with regard to George Washington is that, at the outset, by necessity, there are certain opaque elements of the Constitution, and they trusted that the precedent set by Washington would limit, the discretion for those who came after, even if they didn't have his same character. And in large measure, that proved true for many, many years. That's why the 2 term limit on the presidency was de facto what George Washington said, even though it wasn't written in the Constitution. So those initial steps in relationships between the executive and the Congress and the judiciary that would be unfolding during George Washington's term, they thought would be models for the future. And one of the things that was most prominent in George Washington's presidency, they said that the president cannot use the military offensively unless Congress has deliberated on the matter and specifically authorized it. I do not have the power on my own to use the military offensively. Among other things that he understood also with regard to the so-called signing statements or presidential vetoes. He said, I have to sign or veto a bill in toto. There's not a line item veto. And part of the legislative power, if you will, against the executive is the ability to collect a lot of different provisions in one bill and tell the president, you got to buy it all or none. So that gives them some kind of leverage in the legislative process. Today, we have presidents routinely issue these signing statements, say, these are the parts of the bill that I think are bad and are unconstitutional, so I'm really going to treat them as defunct, something that would have horrified President George Washington. But I say that's why it wasn't not only that he would be the first occupant of the office, but the precedents he set would be viewed as so sacred by his successors that would be virtually binding and kind of limit the ability of future occupants of the office to abuse it. But even his influences wanes after a period of time. Our culture changed. Unfortunately, most people hardly even know George Washington's presidential years. They know he crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day to go after the Hessians who were all drunk, but not a whole lot more. Maybe they know about the cherry tree tale, but the more important elements of his importance as a statesman, getting the country off of ground one, with precedents that should be still binding today are largely unknown. And that's unfortunate, but it's a relic really of our decay as a culture and not understanding that liberty was our birthright, not domination and control. We're not viewed as the chosen people. We were viewed as those who had flaws, and we had to recognize that we're humble. We could be wrong. And that's why we want liberty and free speech to correct the errors of our way. And we don't have a hierarchical society. We have a very egalitarian society when it comes to being in the eyes of the law. We prosper insofar as there's stratification. It's based upon merit, your character and accomplishments, and that's it. And unfortunately, we're really back to plutocracy and hierarchy, and what counts is who you know, not what you know. And it's really quite it'd be truly shocking to all those at the time of the founding, how their handiwork has crumbled, basically like the Roman Colosseum after the fall of Rome.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you made is when you decide to become an empire, that means you have to convert. An empire is preserved through lies. It's one of the tools, the trade of preserving an empire. I think it's also one of the tools of actually justifying empire. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the role of the lies told to the people and helped circulated through some people in the media so that the people would be convinced that our efforts were to be, these, again, as the book title said, splendid liberators, and that the American public was convinced that that's actually what we were doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, the lies they were told first maybe is more oblique than direct, is about the USS Maine in Havana Harbor being blown up by the Spanish, when I think even Admiral Rickover, fabled leader in the Navy, concluded, and even at the time, that it was something that was self-inflicted because of the coal being sparked and blowing up the USS Maine. The Spain as a country had no ulterior motive for getting the United States involved in the war, but we celebrated and said, oh, well, these Spaniards, they're horrible, terrible people. We're going to liberate Cuba. It told lies about what we really wanted, to dominate Cuba, not really give them liberation, which is why we forced their constitution to give us permanent rights on Guantanamo and the right to intervene whenever we thought U.S. interests were imperiled. And of course, we intervened regularly in Cuba for 30, 40 years. And then finally, maybe say it culminated with the Bay of Pigs disaster. So and these were lies that were propagated that.
So remember, the Maine was the precursor to weapons of mass destruction.
WMD, or the second torpedo attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Yeah, you're exactly right. Or the Lusitania. Remember the Lusitania? Yeah, the Lusitania had ammunition on it. It was a legitimate target. So these are the lies that the government maintains in order to establish the empire. It's the good guys and the bad guys. It's like George W. Bush, either for us or against us. And we had clean hands, never did anything in the Middle East that would cause any Muslim to think we were against them, prior to 9/11. We overthrow Mossadegh, we stick in the Shah of Iran, who's a kleptomaniac, who's a brute. He's a hated by his constituents. And then we end up with the Khomeini and the hostages, if you will. But the hostages wouldn't have been there if we hadn't gone in gratuitously and overthrew Mossadegh in 1953, the only really popularly elected Democrat in all of Middle East history. But we thought we would get the oil, and we're doing a favor for Winston Churchill, who wanted the oil for Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the U.S. and the British Navy after World War II. So there is nothing noble about any there. And we go in elsewhere. It's not taught that we basically precipitated genocide in Guatemala when we overthrew a socialist Arbenz in 1954, then followed by these homicidal military maniacs killing all the indigenous people. And we wash our hands like Pontius Pilate, say, that's your problem now, not ours. So the idea that somehow that the United States and Americans are made of different genes than anybody else is a big concoction. But we write about that and celebrate it. We talk about American exceptionalism. What was exceptional about the United States at the start? And that was what James Madison understood. This is Federalist 51. No, we are not made of angels. We need a government. Why? Because we're not angels, that we need to check ourselves. We need separation of powers. We had the humility to understand that if we didn't put handcuffs on ourselves through separation, through deliberation, through what I would call transparency, we're going to be like all the other empires. And it was through these structural provisions in our organic document that made us exceptional, that pitted ambition against ambition. So we preserved liberty. But it was because we were made of the same genes as everybody else that we needed these self restraints, if you will. And we honored them. Other countries didn't. Jeffrey, there's no other country in the world that has anything like our separation of powers. Not even close. I mean, just as so that you go to the Great Britain. Great Britain, if we think it's they don't have separation of powers. Purportedly, you have parliamentary supremacy, but everything is in the ministry. I mean, when we even think about reading in our newspapers what happened in Great Britain, it's all about who is the prime minister, right? The prime Starmer. Previous that, it was Maggie Thatcher, whatever. Nobody even knows that Parliament even exists in Great Britain. And the same is true in France, Macron, or whatever. So whatever their thesis is, it all ends up with executive supremacy. And that's surely true clearly in places like Asia, China, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, all throughout Africa. They're all executive centered. And that's because that is the natural tendency of the species. If you go back to very primitive man, even before you would have anything as sophisticated as a government, you always have one chief, right? One chief runs everything, even the Native American Indians. It's not typically you do not have any kind of consensus or self-governance. And part of that is because if you're there but to project power, you need to have a decision maker, right? You need to have a Caesar if you're about projecting power. And that is basically what the human species is about. And we're unique and said, we don't want to go down that route. We want to preserve liberty, not power. Liberty is our touchstone, not power. The liberty to be yourself and fulfill your ambitions, develop your faculties. That what made us different. And unfortunately, we've lost that understanding, and we're no longer exceptional. We're just the same old Roman Empire, Greek Empire, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, French Empire, and we're trying to kind of push back the tide. But I think we're about as successful as uh, is King Canute making the waves go back. We're trying to make the waves go back, Jeffrey, and they're not doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. When I used to give my talks about Bitcoin, and I was in other parts of the world, and I would talk about like the power of decentralization, and I would say, let me give an example of why I think America was such a great nation and became such a great nation, and what made it exceptional. I said most nations around the world. This is basically just restating what you stated, just in the different terms. I basically said is that America was built on a whole bunch of system of checks and balances on multiple levels and tiers. And because you have in the federal level, the state level, the local level, so there's all these competing checks and balances, and I said the institutions are so strong with respect to systems of checks and balances that basically how great America was had nothing to do with how great our president was. So every other country's greatness or horribleness was a function of who occupied, who was a leader of that country. So because everything is so centralized, that the uniqueness about America is that America's government was more decentralized, than any other government, and the executive power, was so limited for such a long period of time. That's why if you take a look at the 19th century, when America, emerged to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, people don't even know who most of the presidents were in the 19th century. And when you look at who the great presidents were, almost none of them are on the list except for, Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, but, basically nobody else on the list, and nobody even knows who these people are. And they're considered really kind of irrelevant because really the office was somewhat irrelevant. So,
And then I just want to interject, Jeffrey. That's why Woodrow Wilson wrote a book, fabled book called Congressional Government when he's at Princeton. Congressional, this is the 1880s, right? Could you imagine trying to write a book today? Congressional government, it doesn't even exist. It's wallpaper. But you're exactly right. It was the growth. The United States soared, to its capabilities, with the presidents being non-entities. Benjamin Harrison. Well, who's Benjamin Harrison? Millard Fillmore. Who's Millard Fillmore? Zachary Taylor. Andrew Johnson. Rutherford B.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Tiller. Right. William Henry Harrison. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Martin Van Buren. Yeah, these are nondescript people, and the ones that did command attention, they were in the Congress. They were the Henry Clays, and they were the Daniel Websters and John C. Calhouns and Thomas Hart Benton, John Quincy Adams, and Abe Lincoln in the House of Representatives. They were the ones who were the names on the political landscape, not the presidents. And that's where we grew enormously, because we were not then trying to run abroad in search of monsters to destroy and waste all of our talent on proficiency in killing other people. But I go back, to suggest that the difference by the end of the 19th century is at that, as opposed to previously, we had that time because of our success, acquired the industrial power and military might to be an empire if we wanted to. Before that, we really didn't have the ability to do that. And we got sucked in, and we didn't have the leadership to say, no, I don't want to cut that Faustian bargain. We're going to protect liberty. And as George Washington, in a different way, when he was offered the crown before the Constitution, he said, no, I didn't fight this war to be a king. So I'm putting aside the crown permanently. I'll be elected president. I'll go to Mount Vernon as fast as I can. But we didn't have a George Washington in 1900s comes. We had William McKinley, who was no George Washington. I can't say it since I wasn't around there, but all I can say, having read a lot about George Washington, William McKinley, I can say, well, William McKinley was no George Washington, like Dan Quayle was no John Kennedy.
Yes.
But that's what we needed. We needed a George Washington and James Madison at the time of the Spanish-American War, and we didn't have one to resist.
Yeah. I want to, in wrapping in wrapping up today's, unless there are other things you want to mention about the book that you haven't had a chance to say, which I'll certainly give you the opportunity of saying, whatever else you want to talk about specifically of the book. But I'd like to bring up the topic of something that's very relevant today, that I think is pertinent to what we're talking about right now. Uh, Congressman Thomas Massey is now proposing a bill for us to exit NATO. Um, I actually had put up a poll on BitChute's uh, X account, a poll to test whether people support that or not. And so far, from what I understand, at least when we first started the conversation, not a lot. It's a very small sample, so it's not a statistically valid sample. But who's ever reading the poll and voting on it, it's about three-quarters thinking that we should we should exit NATO. So I think the point that you make, that's so compelling, and that should be a reminder of these wars, are is we are the worst versions of ourselves. When we are militaristic in nature, and it's the militarism that has created this. As Madison warned us, what do we have exactly at Madison? We predicted we have a lot of debt. We got a $38 trillion budget deficit. That doesn't even include the underfunding of Social Security and Medicare, whose underfunding is on a uh, on an actuarial basis is significantly more than $38 trillion. Some estimates have it as $200 trillion. The level of underfunding of those obligations and those trust accounts. So we have a lot of debt. We have very high tax rates. We have government spending at all levels, almost half of GDP, and that we're regulating almost everything else. We have troops all over the world, and we have now pretty much an imperial president. So, and all of this came about because we decided to stop being a constitutional republic, and we decided that we wanted to be an empire. And I think that Thomas Massey is making, a very concrete, admirable stance in saying, yeah, we got to give up this empire business. So the first step in giving up this empire business is saying whatever justification might have been for NATO sometime in the past, it doesn't exist anymore. We should acknowledge it doesn't exist, and we should make a stance of, and we don't even know how much that would promote. We would promote freedom and facilitate other peace talks all over the world if we started behaving, if we weren't such an ominous threat to everyone, if we decided that we were going to retrench, and be more judicious about the power that we have. We don't know how more enlightened conversations we'd have with people that we deem as enemies today, who might not be enemies, or to the extent they're enemies, maybe to some extent they're enemies because we created them to be an enemy of us by our actions, and that we should have some responsibility for it. So I would like to mention, if you don't mind, the fact is, that I think I hope that people will support in any way, in a tangible way, writing into other members, whoever you have. If you really want to see a republic return and start sending a message to Congress that we no longer want to be an empire, we want to be a republic. We do want to recall where America greatness came from, and it's not its military. It came from as Bruce has referred to, the building of its industrial base, as an economic power driven by economic and political freedom. Not where we repress others. And we're not splendid liberators. There's no history that demonstrates we're really, splendid liberators. We liberate with a lot of strings attached to that. As long as people serve our interests, then we give them partial liberation in return for something in return that makes them subordinate to us. So we're not really liberating them. We're giving them some benefits in return for acknowledging that they're subordinate to us and they accept us as the head of an empire and accept our rule over the world. And so I think this is an important first step of us retrenching and sending a message. Okay, we think we project power at home through focusing on making our nation great at home by removing government from our life and not having and not having a military presence ever in the world. So I hope everybody, if you don't mind, Bruce,
Yeah.
saying that everybody write to your congressman, write to your senator, write to whoever, and let them know you agree with Thomas Massey, that you support the bill. Go check on the internet. Go check up Thomas Massey's proposal to exit NATO. Read the bill. Make your own judgments for it, and if you're in agreement, make yourselves heard. Make yourselves heard. Stop with the American empire.
Yeah, Jeffrey,
Exit
I
NATO.
got to interject here. Since I drafted a bill and presented to Thomas Massey, I've been trying to get Thomas to do this for years. And of course, the very first one of the decisions of the early Congress was to, by statute, get us out of a defense treaty with France. So this is not novel. So I explained that to Thomas, is going back to the first Congresses. You have authority to override treaty obligations by statute. So I drafted it. Said, and moreover, NATO was the first time in the history of the United States, after over 150 years, where the United States adhered to a defense treaty. The very first time in the history of the United States. And moreover, NATO wasn't a treaty to protect us. It was a treaty to protect empire. We were not worried after when NATO was first presented in 1949. We're the superpower of the world. No one could lay a glove on us. We had an atomic bomb. We had leaving World War II. We had economic domination everywhere. But we created NATO as an excuse to project empire and to try to contain the Soviet Union, if you will, from Western Europe. And moreover, it was wrong also to suggest that NATO was there for just freedom-loving people. We included Portugal in NATO because they had Azores Air Base for us, even though it was run by a complete dictator. So it wasn't even born just of so-called democracies. But it never had any justification at the outset. There's no indication after archives have been revealed and classification ended, Soviet Union ever was about to invade Western Europe anyway. Soviet Union could hardly even contain its own portions of Central and Eastern Europe. It was very fragile, as economically on its back. It lost 20 million in World War II. And of course, we had the atomic bomb at that time. So NATO never was even justified at the outset. That doesn't mean that in the event that there came a time that there was war, that you couldn't have ad hoc alliances, which happens all the time. I mean, we had an ad hoc alliance, maybe alliance too strong with the French in the Revolutionary War. They helped us out at Yorktown with the Navy. So on an individual war basis, you can become allies or not at that time, but we never had any kind of defense commitments to foreign countries. And that was why NATO was drafted in the United States. And the other countries said, if the United States will come protect us for free, that's wonderful. But it wasn't because we had our national security at risk. And then think of since that time, Jeffrey, we now have 28, 29 members of NATO. It started out with 8 or 9. Why do we have, even under Donald Trump, who says he hates NATO in Europe, he brings an amendment to the NATO treaty so we can have Montenegro and North Macedonia in NATO. Really? They're relevant to our national security? The whole thing is an absurdity. It was from the outset. If we need to declare war, we have Congress to declare it. And remember, at the Constitutional Convention, it was understood that if we are attacked, like a Pearl Harbor, so that peace has already been broken by the aggressor, the president can act in self-defense. He doesn't need to wait for Congress to respond. That's where peace has already been broken. But peace has not been broken. We haven't been attacked. Only Congress can take us from peace to war. But it's very clear congressional statutes can override treaties. And I'm all in favor, and I have for years, working with Massey and others to try to get a statute that takes us out of NATO. It's superfluous. We can still have ad hoc agreements if there comes a time of war. We can have commercial arrangements with them. But otherwise, no, Europe has its interests that are separate from ours. We need to retain the flexibility to support only the interests of the United States, not any other country. Every other country acts with that attitude. Why should we be different?
Is there more that you would like to talk about the Splendid Liberators before we conclude this conversation?
I want, yes, I would, because the author, number one, I think there's a disproportionate amount of time devoted to battlefield tactics, which to my mind is not new. And one of the things that I understood by reading Splendid Liberators is that even the author didn't quite understand, and he uses the word empire, but he doesn't understand the breakdown of separation of powers. He doesn't understand, and he doesn't compare, I think, with the founding generation, if you will, and how much it was a break from the founding generation. He does a good job in showing that the empire mentality, but he doesn't associate it, in my judgment, importantly, with limitless executive power, Congress being reduced to an inkblot, and moving forward since that time. He doesn't really project much going forward from the Spanish-American War. But still, it was a good job, and at least he didn't write the book with rose-colored glasses and think, hey, this is all this wonderful. He was able to paint really many of the horrors of the Spanish-American War. But it's difficult, I say. It's very easy from the outside, and even when you're living under a despotism, to say these are things that are imperfect. But what is really different and challenging is, okay, that's true. How do we make it better? And we don't just have a rotating chair of despots. It's just a matter of time, which is what the French Revolution was about. They start out with King Louis, end up with Emperor Napoleon. And that's something that's very difficult. And that's why I call 1787, it was a miracle. It's going to happen once very little. If we had a Constitution Convention, Jeffrey, today, there is no way we could ever come up with a document that wouldn't give us a despotism. We do not have the brains and philosophical depth and character to give us that kind of a document. And that's why we should cherish what was given to us 250 years ago and recognize that they were a little bit wiser than we are when it comes not to moving things fast or proficiency in killing, but it comes to preserving liberty, if that's what you want to make the country about. And I think most Americans, given a choice, would choose liberty over empire.
I wish that was the case. That point I disagree with you.
Yeah.
I think Americans feel that they have enough liberty and freedom, and that the trade-off of, what they're trading off to be an empire, I think makes them pretty happy. I would like to. Well, things might be different if we had a draft.
Yeah.
If we had a draft rather than an all-volunteer army, maybe people, if they had the risk and threat of having skin in the game. This is what happens when you have. It's a perverse system of governance when not enough people have skin in the game.
Yeah.
So I think this is the flaw of the system today. Is the fact is that in the past, the government didn't do very much. The government didn't ask much of us, and we didn't ask much of the government. So most of the government was local, and it was the things that we did that were improper, acts of coercion against other people's property, or committing certain types of frauds, got us in problems. And so those were generally handled on local matters and through contracts. So it's not like we had to get to a lot of regulatory bodies and all the things that people now need to go through, and the permissions of establishing a business, and how many people review those businesses and how many rules and regulations you have to comply with. So, things are, much, much different today, than they were, back then. And so people have gotten used to, have become trained and accustomed to, to being, to being someone of level of control. I can tell you, like the last time I used to really enjoy, going and seeing the fireworks in New York for 4th of July. So, and then the last time I went, they decided, for my safety, for everyone else's safety, to basically treat us like cattle. So they had these routes that you had to go in. I used to just be able to go and walk to the water, whether it was on the East River or the Hudson River, whichever that was being shown, or, Midtown or downtown or wherever, the different locations that they had it. All I knew is I could just walk there, try and get as close to, the river as possible and get to see it. And I had unimpeded, Then one of the times I went, they had decided to organize people, and they had all these barriers, and I felt like I'm cattle. So I'm being ushered along, by the police. You're sitting there waiting. One of the women couldn't stand anymore, and like there was a little curb that she could sit in, and so she went around the barrier to just sit on that curb, and it seems like she was in really a lot of pain with her legs, and the police officer, of course, told her to go back behind the barrier. So it's just inhumane. I yelled at the police officer. The police officer yelled back at me. I told her she should not move, and that we all who were sitting behind the barrier should make sure that the policeman doesn't move her. But everybody else was silent. Nobody supported me. So she went back, and I'm sure maybe the policeman thought if she does it, then somebody else will do it, and they'll lose control. But I sat back and I said, I'm supposed to live in a free country. Okay. Why is there so much distrust that everyone's a potential terrorist here? That I have to be in a barrier, and like I'm being shepherded like I'm cattle. So I thought it was like so demeaning. I said, I'm never doing this again. So in New Year's Eve, which is why I stopped going to New Year's Eve in New York. When I stayed at the when I stayed at when I my apartment was between on right my apartment then was on 53rd between 5th and 6th, right across the street from the museum MoMA, and because that was where a lot of traffic was New Year's Eve. If I went to a dinner restaurant and then had to get back to my apartment, I had to show proof at every corner. A cop is stopping you to show you, and I'm not blaming the cop. I mean, they don't set the rules; they're following the rules that they're told that they have to do. And so they're just doing what they're told. But I said I have to now show everybody a document, and I'm not exactly every street corner I had to show, and I said, there's proof of my address. I'm going to my apartment. Okay, you can walk to the next street, and then the next street there'd be another cop there. Here's the piece of paper showing you I live at this address, and then I could go to the next block and do this. And I said, really, what kind of world do we live in that I can't just, I used to be able just to New Year's Eve go out and not have to worry about all these protective barriers and stuff like that, where we have to quote this security that we have that I think is the illusion of security. It's just conditioning us to accept being controlled. So I think we've already conditioned ourselves because we live in a society where we're already accustomed to the fact that how free are we if almost everything we need to do, we need to ask permission. So we've already been indoctrinated, and we've already accepted this indoctrination that we know we're not really free people. We know we really don't have inalienable rights, but the government is reasonably not horrible at giving us permission. They're not so unreasonable that we're kind of satisfied, because to want anything more is just too inconvenient. So the inconvenience of complying with government rules and regulations is considered a sufficient price, and given the taxes that people pay, or the small percentage than the pay taxes, and again, not enough people have skin in the game. Half the people don't pay an income tax. Many people get back more from the government than they pay in, so they're actually getting more money from other people, and so whatever the government spends, nobody has really skin in the game, and many of these people just have a job. I mean, I shouldn't say just have a job, but I mean they're not doing an activity as an entrepreneur, so they don't really have to ask permission except the company that employs them. Since most of these people are employed by somebody else, they don't really have to ask the government for permission. They just have to convince somebody to hire them, and once they convince somebody to hire them, they just show up and work and hope that they keep their job and advancing in their job. But ultimately, what skin do they have in the game? And basically, people have, no skin in the game. And so, of course, how am I going to use the military if I know that it's never going to be me? Okay. So I think this governance system is really perverse. And I think if the founders took a look at this governance system today and said, we have a government that is as huge as it is, has as huge a deficit that it has, and has so few people with a skin in the game of a government that does so much. You know, I think,
But part of it, Jeffrey, I think
like this.
is the skin in the game. Can have more than one dimension. I think, because and I think that the difference maybe between you and me is I do think that people can respond to proper leadership, that they can inspire them, they can be better than themselves. And part of having skin in the game is wanting posterity to inherit, your children, your grandchildren, to inherit the same freedom you got. And so you're not so selfish that, hey, you're just going to stand up and embrace norms that you feel comfortable with, even if it means your grandchildren inherit despotism. So in some sense, we all got skin in the game because we're going to have successors, those yet to be born, and we want to elicit their gratitude that we fought and respected, even if they didn't have immediate votes or political donations. We respected the rights that they ought to have that we enjoyed.
Well, I think if we were concerned about that, we would not have a $38 trillion,
Yeah, I agree for sure.
and
For sure.
and we would not have over $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities.
No,
So,
but I'm just saying that because we don't have the models, we don't see the people who are worthy of emulation because everybody's on the take. Everybody has an ulterior motive. People then go to the lowest common denominator. They're not inspired to act above their immediate corporeal interests because there aren't any George Washingtons around anymore. There are no James Madisons around. There are no Thomas Jefferson, John Adams around. Look, or our icons, who the football players or Taylor Swift or somebody who's what are the movie actors or whatever. These are people maybe that have their particular skills, but they're not philosophers. They don't teach the meaning of life and what's virtuous and how we should definitely sacrifice for our posterity because our ancestors sacrificed for us. We don't have people who talk in that vein. I say when Benjamin Franklin was around, even when he's young in his 30s, he used to be able to organize in the community people who would come together every week and read books and talk about philosophy and where the United States should go. And Ben Franklin couldn't get anybody to join him today. That's no, we don't want to do that. We have something else we have to work with Bitcoins. We're going to invade Venezuela or do something else. That's largely drivel or build a ballroom. I mean, Thomas Jefferson would be appalled at a ballroom. He used to appear in his slippers. He didn't believe in all these external adornments in the presidency. But yeah, say change has to begin somewhere. As like they say, if not us, who? If not now, when? Even if it takes a long time afterwards. And I think that's what our discussions are intending to promote, Jeffrey. We're not so delusional to think we're going to change 100 years of growth overnight. But somebody has to start the process. And that's what the Chinese say when they speak of a journey of 1,000 miles, begin with a single step. If we're this first step, okay, we got 999 miles to go further, but someone's got to take the first step.
well, thank you. Anything else you wanna add to this conversation? I think I really enjoyed this, and I really enjoyed. I found the book, tedious at various parts of the book. In general, I found it tedious, but I think sometimes tedious is acceptable to the extent that you're trying to learn a real lesson and feel like you're living through the experiences that the people who were victims lived through.
Yeah.
And so I think the book did a pretty good job of giving it from the perspective of not just ourselves but the people whose lives we were impacting against their will. And we should be more cognizant of the consequences of our behavior, of the externalities we create through our own actions. We should be, I once read that the definition between, honesty and integrity, is honesty is when you tell the truth. Integrity is more than just when you tell the truth. It's you tell the truth also with the understanding of the consequences your actions have on other people. So that really integrity is like a higher standard than honesty. Honesty is a subset of having integrity, but it's just not enough to just have honesty. You need to have integrity, because if your behavior has an adverse consequence on somebody else, you might be honest about it, but is that a virtue? Is that a virtue?
No, it's not. But it's. I think, Jeffrey, it goes back to Abe Lincoln. He says, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." Because he understood being a master is self defeating. It's harm yourself because it degrades your own values. It degrades your own virtue. It says, I don't want to be a master. I don't want to be a slave either. And that's the understanding that we have to have. We don't want to be a colony, but we don't want to be a colonizer either. Um, Unfortunately, we're long past that, and we have to start the journey backwards that begins with discussions like this and deciding, no, we made a mistake in the Spanish-American War by choosing empire. It's not going to change overnight, but we need the pendulum go, and we need to downsize, if you will, in the business sense, and retreat. So we have invincible self-defense. We still have influence abroad. It's the influence of example. And I keep returning to the fact that the United States of America, as tiny as we were at the time of the Declaration and the U.S. Constitution, 3 or 4 million on the Atlantic coast, we were the world's superpower when it came to ideas. And all Europe and Asia trembled because of our ideas. Government by the consent of the government, unalienable rights. That terrified everywhere. What do you mean? You mean I don't have the right to rule over you because I was born king or queen or something? I'm a squire, that kind of thing. And those ideas still have enormous, enormous influence if we are faithful to them. Obviously, our ability to influence abroad diminishes if we're hypocrites and no one believes that what we say is really what we practice. And they see that we are dishonoring our highest values. But if we are true, and we still have a legacy, although it's diminishing rapidly, of being more superior, not perfect, but superior to alternate forms of government. It will reverberate more than the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. It killed a lot of people and changed nothing.
Well, I want to let everybody know who's going to watch this that the intention is to do these book reviews twice a month. We might not accomplish it because of the holiday season that's impending, and so the next one will let you know whether it's going to be before the holiday season or right after the new year, and we'll keep people informed of when the next one will be and what the next book Bruce will choose.
Yeah.
But that this will be on a consistent dates when we start 2026. And again, the intention is that we will be doing this twice a month to give people adequate time to read the books that we will be discussing, or at least investigate a summary of the books. We will be encouraging, we'll be better organized, so we're encouraging people who want to ask questions, that will give people enough advance notice that they could submit questions, or during the live stream they could provide their questions. But we want everyone to be involved in this conversation, and we want people to be actively involved and actively engaged in the conversation. So I want to let everybody know that questions not only are welcome, they're desired.
Yeah.
And I want to do, because Bruce is too modest, I want to plug another book, or at least mention another book that you should do due diligence on. It's called Constitutional Peril: The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy. And that book was written by Bruce. So, if you check it out, one of the people that suggests reading this, if this has any meaning to you, is Ron Paul, is one of the people that writes a blurb saying, this is a book that recommend reading this book, among others. But not Ron Paul was the only one, but he was one of the people, that suggested that this was something highly worth reading. So I'd like you to consider during this holiday season to read, and I will tell you. I will also, because I want to further encourage and subsidize, the reading. So I will say that there is a Kindle version. So the first 10 people that write into, should write into Johnny, which is JONNY @bitshoot.com, and say, I want a copy of the book. And I will. This will not be a gift from BitChute. This is a gift from me, but I will give 10 copies of Bruce's book out to the first 10 people that write to Johnny and say, I want a copy. So in case you don't have the money to buy the book, don't worry about that. As long as you have the desire to buy the book, I'll buy it on your behalf, so you get to read it. So again, it's JONNY @bitshoot.com. Write Johnny, tell him I want a copy of Bruce's book. Constitutional Peril, and I will arrange for I will buy it and have it sent to you by the Kindle version. So which of course you can read on multiple any device. So has a Kindle app, and so you can read it. So so I'd like to make that book available to anyone. I've read it, and I suggest reading it. And maybe it'll be one of the books that Bruce will suggest, but
Yeah.
it's probably too humble to self-suggest his own writing. So I would not be so humble. So, so, so Bruce, concluding words?
No, I think I can give a preview. I think the next book that I will do, it's written by Washington Post reporters, is about the process in which the investigation of January 6th proceeded in the Justice Department, the decisions made, because I think it's so relevant today. In its recent publication, and that's the one I've selected for our next book review.
What's its title?
I'm not. I think it's. Let's see if you can hold on a second here. Carolyn, let's see. No, I can't find it right now.
Okay, don't worry about it. We'll get a banner up. If you could run the title, we'll get a banner up. This week. We'll just get me the title. I'll get the banner up so people have more than advance notice, and you and I will have to agree on a date that we'll do this. So we'll get the banner up as soon as you and I have an agreement on what date we'll both be able to make.
Okay, I'll send it to you right after.
And we'll let people know as soon as you and I decide. As soon as you let me know the book and we decide a date, we'll put up a banner, or we'll just put up a thumbnail, and the thumbnail will announce it so that people have adequate advance notice to be able to read that book and to participate in this conversation. So, Bruce, as always, thank you so much, and as usual, I always learn something from every conversation we have.
That's the most important thing. If I can help somebody critically think, that's the high point of my day. That's what we're about, trying to be higher life forms, given our cerebral faculties, and not descend, to what I call the hormonal gratifications. That's the fight. Make sure the cerebral faculties defeat the hormonal gratifications, and you'll never have a boring day in your life, and you'll be rewarded for sure. I'll tell you that. Okay. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Talk to you soon. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.